Hey everybody, welcome to the WHS Chess Club YouTube channel where I'm going to go over your games. If you have a game you want me to go over on video, let me know. Send it to me or we'll talk about it during the club or during other classes at school. I'm going to go over a game versus Lawrence that it's a game with Lawrence versus me actually. So I'm going to go over that game with you right now. I was playing white and Lawrence was playing black. He plays the Sicilian defense here, which is c5, and I am going to play what's called the Grand Prix attack, which is characterized by the E and F pawns being moved towards the center. And there we go. Lawrence plays a bad move right out of the gate here, knight f6, which the proper way to punish knight f6 is to play e5. At the board, I didn't make this move because I am basically trying out an opening that I know very little about. I know the basic ideas, but I'm not comfortable with it enough to punish bad moves when they pop up in a blitz game. In a longer game, I have no doubt I would have found e5, but in a blitz game, I just wasn't looking for ways to punish a suspect move like that. It's a fairly normal looking move other than the fact that e5 attacks it right away, but most of the time in most openings the knight is going to have some place it can run to. However, in this one, none of the squares that the knight can go to are safe. All of these squares are off limits. The knight attacks these two, so knight d5 and knight e4 just both lose to knight takes, and then both of these squares are on the queen's diagonal and unprotected, so they would also lose the knight. The only place to go then is back to b8. So e5 would have punished that pretty well. Back to the game, instead of playing e5, I played knight f3, just developing. And one of the reasons I play knight f3, by the way, is when white plays f4, it weakens this diagonal right here. And that's a pretty important thing. I usually feel a lot of draft around my king whenever I play f4, and playing knight f3 as soon as you possibly can afterwards is a big deal because these two squares right here are protected by the knight. And this square in particular, h4, is the square that, say, the queen can get to punish this diagonal being open. So very often when I play f4, I'm going to play knight f3 as soon as I can, just as a matter of principle. Now, it wasn't any big deal here because the queen can't get out to that diagonal. But that was at least why I play knight f3 here without really thinking in a blitz game. In a blitz game, a lot of times you're just moving quickly and not really assessing everything accurately, which is unfortunate and one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of playing blitz anyway. Alright, so some more normal moves here. This is pretty typical Grand Prix attack stuff. When you get the light square bishop outside of the pawn chain and then play d3, it makes sure that your light square bishop is not trapped behind. If it's trapped behind d3, it has far less scope than it does if it gets out first. So often you'll want to play bishop b5 and then d3, and the whole reason you want to play d3 is so that now you can get this bishop out. And yes, this bishop is hemmed in by f4, but the f-pawn is going to move to f5 at some point, particularly if black plays g6. g6, bishop g7, and castles is a pretty typical plan in this opening, and in a lot of Sicilians. So f5 would be attacking the king's castled position. Happens quite a lot. And when f5 is played, this bishop has tons of scope on that diagonal. Okay, moving on. Lawrence plays another suspect move here in the opening that, given enough time, can be punished. Let's count the number of times that this pawn is defended. It's defended once by the pawn, and now twice by the knight. It's attacked once by my pawn, and again, now twice by the knight. But the problem here is that this knight is vulnerable because of the bishop bearing down on it. So the correct move here for me would have been bishop takes c6. After bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, the pawn is now attacked twice and defended once, and here white is just up a pawn for nothing. do want to call your attention once again to this diagonal, and now how easy it would be for the queen to get to h4. So it's a little bit dangerous, but almost no matter what black plays here, white can just play knight f3, once again guarding that diagonal. And also, almost no matter what, another option would be just a castle, getting off of that diagonal and getting the rook onto the now open f-file. So another missed opportunity for me, which happens often in blitz games, so no big deal. Okay, clear, and there we go. So instead of playing bishop takes c6 and capitalizing on the mistake of e5, I played f5. This opens up my bishop and makes it a little bit harder for black to castle comfortably over here. g6 is now a little bit less enticing. This bishop now has less scope now because the g6 pawn, or the g7 pawn, is probably going to stay put, so now bishop e7 is the only place it can go. Not a whole lot of room to maneuver there. So f5 seemed attractive to me at the time. Now Lawrence plays a nice little move here, getting the knight into a central outpost. It can't really be kicked from there. Normally I could play, or under other circumstances, I could play c3, making the knight leave. But I can't play c3 now because the knight is there. So maybe someday I can move my knight and play c3. I have to also be careful here because now my my bishop and black's bishop are kind of facing off here, and I have a little bit of tension there. So often the best thing to do in this case, I can't move my knight away, like I can't play, say, knight e2 here, because then my bishop just hangs. So oftentimes the best thing to do here is to just get rid of black's bishop by taking it, which is check, so it's okay to throw that move in most of the time. This is usually a good move because this is white's bad bishop. Bad because it's on the same color, the light squares, as, oh, I'm having some trouble there. There we go. As white's central pawns, light squares. And that makes the light square bishop a bad bishop, and it makes the dark square bishop a good bishop. You can see how much more easily this bishop can get around the pawns than this one. This one would run into them all the time. So what I've done basically in playing bishop takes d7 is I've traded my bad bishop for black's good bishop. And this is black's bad bishop here because of the central pawns for black. So taking that bishop is a good move for the reasons I said. And now knight takes d4 is a severe mistake on my part, and I'll show you why in just a minute. First I want to show you what the correct move would have been, and you can see the arrow. Bishop g5. The reason bishop g5 is a good move is something that just blows me away that I missed this. First of all, I'll show you the line. In order to prevent doubling up the pawns here, for instance, if black plays a move like castle queenside or something, just a nothing move, then bishop takes knight, and now g takes f, doubles up these two pawns. Not a critical weakness in this position, but it's not something that you really want to go for. Both of these two pawns are weak in this position. So in order to prevent that, black has a couple of moves. One is just to move the knight away. He could go knight g4 here, which may have its own problems, I'm not really sure. But knight g4, or the other move, which I think is actually correct here, would be bishop e7. And that way, if bishop takes knight, then black can recapture with the bishop, and everything's fine as far as the pawn structure is concerned. But in this line, white can continue by taking the knight, and then after the recapture, take black's knight. And now there's a big fat hole on d5 for white's knight, and white's knight in this position is the most powerful piece on the board, even doing more than the queens are at this point. It's controlling all sorts of central squares, and it's unassailable. This bishop cannot touch this knight, ever, if that knight stays on that square. Any other pieces on the board are typically more valuable than that knight. What I've done is I've made this knight way more valuable than this bishop, which is the bad bishop for black, and these rooks are the only thing relatively close to the same value as that knight that might be able to trade themselves for it. So maybe someday black could play rook c8, rook c5, and then take it, and white basically has cashed in the value of this knight for the value of that rook, which would be a very good trade. If black doesn't touch it, then that knight is just very powerful for the whole game. So this would have been a great position for white, and probably enough to win the game. Instead, I made a horrible move, which was the knight takes d4, making my c3 knight run back to e2. And to me, this wasn't that bad of a position. Optically, in other words, visually it looked nice, because I have all this space on the king's side to attack. I have a good bishop, which has lots of scope towards the attacking side. I can castle, play queen e1, queen h4, and I can get my queen into the attack. Things are looking pretty good to me, but I overlooked a key concept that Lawrence went right for. I was impressed with this move quite a bit because he played it quickly, and this is a move that a lot of people don't see and don't understand why it's valuable. And that's d5. d5 gets rid of a weakness for black. The d6 pawn is the weak part of this pawn chain. You can see that these pawns are both guarded, this one's not. So someday, white may be able to attack that d6 pawn, and then these pawns become vulnerable. So what we do here, we get rid of the d6 pawn, and yes, it's true that e5 then becomes weak. But the more important thing that d5 does is it breaks up white's pawn chain, and white's pawns in the center are going to become very weak, and black is going to have increased scope for his pieces. So as it stands right now, black's pieces are not very good. As soon as d5 is played, this bishop becomes alive, white's center starts to crumble, and things go in completely the opposite direction that I thought they were going to go to begin with. So now this pawn right here is attacked twice and defended only once, so white has that immediate problem to deal with. By the way, white could take that pawn, but even just knight takes here, this pawn is now in some trouble. This knight is now in a really good position, and even queen takes, it's not terrible. Now we have a queen right in the center of the board, and it's making some threats, and black is looking good in both cases. I think black is probably better there. So I made the decision to try to defend e4. So now e4 is the base of the pawn chain, and it's attacked once and defended once. So things are okay here. However, black has much more space in the center and much more activity for his pieces. So Lawrence does a pretty good job of generating threats here, making a threat on c2, making a threat on e4 here. So white has to respond to lots of threats here. All good moves here. White can play queen takes d2 or king takes d2. I thought queen takes d2 probably lost the e4 pawn, so I took with the king, intending maybe to try to get the rook on a1 over into the king side, where I could maybe push my g and h pawns. It's really, you can see though that even that plan is a little bit difficult to pull off because this knight is in the way and it doesn't really have anywhere to go. There aren't really any spots. Even knight h5 would be not that great. It works, I guess, because the queen is there, but you know, the queen has better things it can be doing, and it may even need to be defending some other stuff over here, so defending this knight is not ideal for the queen to be doing. So this idea here isn't that great, but white doesn't have a whole lot of options after that great move that Lawrence played on d5 kind of made this whole thing happen. And now Lawrence is still generating threats on c2, so like I said, white has to respond defensively. Two different moves here. That the game move was queen b6, but I thought that knight g4 looks pretty good. Knight g4 threatening knight f2, threatening knight e3. This would have been pretty devastating, I think. King c1 is one possibility, and that just leaves knight f2 wide open. And if white tries to defend with rook f1, defending the f2 square, then queen h6 is pretty strong. I think this looks pretty horrible for white. I think black is doing great here. Loses a pawn to knight g2 at the very least, and you can see that none of black's threats are going away in this position. So back to the game. Lawrence didn't play knight g4, but played instead queen b6, again generating all kinds of threats. Looking at the b2 pawn here. And so kind of castling manually here, moving the king behind the pawns. But this is also into the attack. So I'll run through the rest of this game pretty quickly. Lawrence is pretty clinical in the way he finishes me off here. Still trying to defend threats, and Lawrence is getting all his pieces into the game. Now I'm thinking, okay, get some counterplay over here on the king's side. I want to play g4, g5. Lawrence doesn't give me time to do that. Now here, for some reason, my mind went blank. I was running low on time. My mind kind of played a trick on me and thought that he self-pinned his b5 pawn there. And if he moves it, then I can just take the rook on a6, but it was just obviously that's incorrect because the queen's defending it. So I thought, well, I have time now, because he can't move the b-pawn, to do this, to keep attacking over here. And this is pretty much desperation anyway. But of course I was wrong, so I try to trade queens. He just takes the pawn, I take his pawn, and you know, there are some inaccuracies through here. I think if I just take on d4 right here, I'm actually doing pretty well, and I can maybe withstand. Maybe it's right here that I play d4 and everything's okay instead of c4. But I've given him two connected passed pawns, and it's a time scramble for me anyway. But it's dead lost either way, and I'll show you the end of the game so you can see how Lawrence finished me off. I thought this switch of playing rook h6 here, attacking my completely undefendable h3 pawn, because if it moves away, those two pawns are going to kill me immediately. So I had to block, I had to get the king up there to try to block things. And of course rook takes h3 now makes e3 a threat. And the game's over at this point. Basically, I could have resigned here, and he finds great move rook h1, which means he's going to promote with e1 equals queen on the next move. So this was a very well played game by Lawrence. Not perfect by either one of us, but it was a lot of fun. I thought it showed that Lawrence is coming along quite well in his development. I thought the best move of the game was d5, although he played a lot of good moves. I thought I missed some opportunities in the opening, and I thought Lawrence missed a pretty devastating move a little bit later on in knight g4. But overall, very well played game. Thanks for watching. Send me your games, and I'll be glad to talk about them in a similar manner. See you next time.